This is Social Europe Podcast. We are dedicated to strengthening democracy by discussing the most pressing political, economic, and social issues of our time. So welcome and enjoy the conversation.
Well, Mark Blyth, thank you very much indeed for joining me on Social Europe Podcast today on a very important and prescient topic. So we're talking about the global repercussions, and especially for the EU, of the incoming Trump presidency, and especially when it comes to the political and economic circumstances in which we find ourselves in now, or probably in 2 weeks' time. So just to get us started, maybe, if you think about, how Trump's America First agenda might play out and what potential sort of trade policies he might implement, what are the potential disruptions for the EU, and how do you think the EU should, deal with that risk and try to mitigate it?
Well, they had 4 years to sort of build up some sort of set of strategies or, at least contingency plans for this. And it was perfectly obvious that Biden was not going to do this for at least 12 months. And everyone still seems to be surprised by this. And the lesson that I take from that is that everyone thought 2016 was an aberration. But it's not. It's the new normal. And we see this by the fact that reform, brought to you by the guy who did Brexit, is riding high in the polls. We see this by the fact that if Macron bops out, it's very likely that it's going to be the National Front that's the lead party. AfD's confined basically to the eastern hinterland, but nonetheless you can see in Austria this is breaking out and lots of other places. So there's this weird sort of denialism in Europe whereby these people, these disruptive people, the populists, are just sort of some error term in the equation, and somehow things will settle down. And I think that's been the biggest sort of weakness that's happened. Now, when you don't actually take it seriously, you don't have any contingency plans, then you are not prepared for what's coming next. And what makes it worse is it's deeply uncertain what's coming next, because what we can figure out about the Trump administration so far is that it's filled with a bunch of people who would probably like to give Europe a good kicking for no apparent reason. But it depends which one's still standing by the time they start actually doing policy. It depends what happens with executive orders out of the gate. Hell, it's not completely impossible that Trump comes in, declares a national emergency on whatever grounds, suspends the Constitution, and God knows where we are from there. So at this point, sort of scenario planning what can happen, you could go for anything. This could go from the worst imaginable to absolutely nothing. And we have no data to go on yet. We just don't know. Now, having said that, what doesn't he like? He doesn't like NATO. I think we've established this by now, that he really doesn't like NATO. He's put out some kind of political capital in the sense that I'm going to end the Ukraine war. So how that's going to happen, we don't know. If it is going to happen, we don't know. I don't see how you actually manage to make that work without NATO, but at the same time, he doesn't like NATO. So there's contradiction number one. Contradiction number two, back in the day, used to be about cars and car exports and the German auto complex and the fact that they're selling all these cars in America. Now that the German auto complex is largely in crisis, as is the greater European auto complex because of Chinese competition shift to electrics, I think that's actually even a sort of a secondary concern at this point. Tariffs, yeah, on everyone. Why not? I mean, Denmark over Greenland. I mean, we're dealing with such randomness. It's very hard to have a sort of this is what's going to happen. But we can work through various scenarios, but we just don't know.
So even, in the US, there's simply no idea what he's going to do on day one.
Nobody knows. Literally, they could suspend the Constitution next Tuesday. We don't know.
I mean, you can see even how is your assessment of his his own stability vis-a-vis his first term? I mean, now from what you can read in the media is that the MAGA movement is really, building up steam against the tech bros. And, this kind of coalition that sort of helped him back into office again seems very fragile, at least when it comes to topics like immigration and such. They could completely break up the coalition. So what's your reading on this?
Does he need the coalition? I mean, I always who was it again? I think it was Panebianco, the Italian political scientist, that did a riff on Rousseau, who basically said that once every 4 years or so, the public kind of elects a bunch of people to run stuff. And then once they've done that, there's really no control. And, there's there's a certain truth to this, particularly in the American system. Now, of course, he can get punished in the midterms, in Congress, all that sort of stuff. But as far as he's concerned, he's got back on top. He's dodged jail. He's back in power with a mandate as far as he sees it, because the Democrats were awful. And he's been quite clear about what he wants to do. He wants to do mass deportations and tariffs. Now, let's try and put some sense into this, right? What would be the possible reasons for doing this? Well, there is actually a reason, and some people around Trump do tend to think this way. Do you remember the Klein and Pettis book from a few years ago, Our Trade Wars, Class Wars?
I don't.
Oh, you should read it. It's very good. It's very popular with this crowd. And basically what it says is that the only people who really benefit from globalization and trade are the large corporations that get excess profits from doing so, and ultimately workers are screwing each other in a kind of a race to bottom. I simplify somewhat, but essentially that's it. And the basic story is the following. You need an importer for all those exporters. So you've got structural exporters, basically East Asia, Germany, Greater Europe, etc. And you need one big importer, which is the US. So we get cars and TVs and computers and everything else from you guys, and we give you digital certificates bearing 2%. Now, it's been a brilliant deal for us, but it means that we don't make anything anymore. And if you really want to be a superpower and you really want to run the 21st century, you can't do that. You can't have your largest civilian employer be Walmart, and your largest increasing employer is Amazon warehousing. That's not good. So you need to stop this. And there'd be talked about things like doing a financial transactions tax, something that used to be very much for the left, to stop people holding American assets, etc. And in a sense, wean themselves off this kind of credit dependency you get from the global role of the dollar. Now, if you really want to do that and you think it's a good idea, and remember that global rebalancing used to be something the left talked about, why would you want to do this? Well, you do this because not just you're hollowing out your economy, you're pushing down wages, because you're pushing everyone into low productivity service sector employment. You're taking entire areas that used to be industrial and just allowing them to wither. And that's not how you do things if you want to be a superpower. So what tools do you have if you want to do this? And I think there's an analogy with central banks. Central banks are asked to do a lot, but they really have two tools: raise and lower the price of money, buy and sell assets. And governments, when they want to rebalance the global economy, really have very few tools, and one of them is tariffs. Now, let's say that you bang up the tariffs and then you force adjustment on the exporters. They have to consume their own surplus. You get some rebalance, and this takes years, of course, right? Well, what do you do in the meantime to relieve the pressure? Well, if you basically take immigrant labor out of the equation, you cause an artificial squeeze in the labor market. That encourages companies to do technological upgrading. That allows them to pay higher wages to the native labor force, and you begin to get a virtuous circle of both internationally and domestically. Now, that is the only sense I can make out of this. I have heard bits of that coming from the administration, but I've never heard anyone actually in the administration say, here is the plan, this is what we're doing. But if I had to think this through, that's what I think they're doing.
And, if we just take a scenario in which he just slaps tariffs on pretty much everything. I mean, before there is this sort of benign or virtuous cycle of a sort of rebalancing, I mean, isn't there a big inflation danger in the short term? And especially,
Definitely.
Fueling already
but why do you think
cost of living crisis.
Why do you think they want to pump an extra 3 million barrels of gas a day? Because we're self-sufficient in energy, and if we crush the price down to $25 a barrel, we'll piss off our wildcatters, but we'll basically crush energy prices and input prices. So the cost of living spike you get through imports, which you want to do less of anyway, is to in part compensated by lower energy costs.
So an expansion of the own drill baby drill.
Absolutely, but for macroeconomic reasons. Scott Bessent is not a fool. There's a reason he wants 3% interest rates and 3 million barrels a day.
Okay, and in such a scenario, I mean, obviously that would have huge repercussions on the European Union. So what?
Oh my God, absolutely. This is the problem. When you're long exports, this is the bit that people like you and me have been saying this for years, right? When you're long exports, you're vulnerable to the person who buys your export saying, thanks, but no thanks. And when you do that at a time when particularly German industry is emerging into a secular crisis, so another round of let's cut wages and welfare benefits is not going to solve the problem that you're on the technologically wrong side of the street. But nonetheless, you're into a secular crisis at exactly the time when they're going to start doing tariffs. your ability to rebalance is hamstrung by the fact that you run an export-oriented macro policy. Undervalued exchange rate, debt break, low debt, low consumption. You're going to have to boost your consumption. You're going to have to spend more. You're going to have to go against all of the learnings, shall we say, that Europe has had on how to run an economy for the past 30 years if they start doing this.
Well, I mean, as we talked about for years, I mean, there's a lack of investment in Germany, and in pure financial terms, recycling the current surplus in Germany, especially if the debt brake is hopefully being reformed at the beginning of the next parliamentary term. That's one thing, but the danger, as far as I can see, is, look, he's going to say to Volkswagen and all the others, you can still sell cars here, but you've got to produce them here as well.
Yeah, that's right.
Right. So
that's the other way you do rebalancing. Like, the tariff is not an end in itself. The tariff is like, you can still sell a $20,000 car here, but you need to make it here for it to be $20,000. That's exactly it.
Exactly. Yeah. So Chattanooga, you got to produce the Volkswagens in Tennessee, not in Wolfsburg.
Yeah. And then your global supply chains that you do with the higher end products, for example, the transmissions that I think are made in Romania, which end up in pretty much cars all over the world, that model becomes really problematic because you're going to have to localize the supply chains.
But wasn't that, I mean, if you remember correctly, that especially, in the first time he put tariffs on and threatened tariffs, that especially, once the end product, once the production line was in the US, the inputs in the value chain, they were exempt from tariffs.
Yeah, no, and it could be that. Like I say, let's go back to our original conversation. Nobody knows anything. Nobody knows what's going to happen, right? I'm sketching out the best I can figure out what these people might be doing in a macro sense, and I could be utterly wrong, but that's how I tend to think about it until I've got other information.
Okay, well, let's go at it slowly. Who do you think are the key people? Who are the brains behind the policy?
That I don't actually know, and I think it's kind of pointless naming names at this point. Do you remember Scaramucci, who was very briefly the press secretary? Right. Scaramucci.
Well, that was 10 days, though, wasn't it?
10 days, right. No, but he had a great line on this a few months ago where he says, people are trying to guess who's in the inner circle, the outer circle. It doesn't matter. Unless you're family, you eventually end up in the wood chipper. And I think that that's true, right? So Scott Bessent's obviously in charge now. Cantor Fitzgerald guy that they've got running the Treasury. Your cabinet is basically filled with tech billionaires. There's going to be huge action on crypto, which is going to cause an enormous flood of money into crypto. Huge Ponzi bubble and eventual burst. I will be buying at that point. There's a lot of things that can happen. But, when you start saying, well, this person's going to, who knows? It's just pointless.
Okay.
Remember what they used to say about Europe was like the American president would complain, I don't know who to call when I call Europe, right? Now nobody knows who to call, because if you don't talk to Donald directly, nobody knows who you're talking to.
Oh dear. Okay, so we established the policy is anybody's guess. The people is anybody's guess at this stage. So in a time frame, when do you think we will have a broad idea how things are going to shake out? Will that happen really from, the 20th, 21st of January? And,
I think it'll be
2 weeks in, we're going to have a good idea?
I think by the middle of next week, we're all going to have a very good idea what's going on. I expect a blitz of executive orders, like an absolute snowstorm on everything. And then once we shake out that and figure out who's going to countersue and how the courts are going to deal with it, etc., then we'll have a rough understanding of what they want to achieve in certain areas. Ultimately, it's Congress that passes legislation. That means that he doesn't just get to write it and we will do this. We'll see what he does on deportations. This is going to be a really, really hard one to do for multiple reasons. Not just because it looks really bad, but because it's very expensive and logistically really challenging. Is he going to issue an executive order to empower the military and the National Guard at a state level to intercept people on suspicion of being foreign? I wouldn't say no. And once you do that, I mean, wow, where do we go from there?
I mean, and one of the things that, is it's always seems to be the thing that has got his latest attention, right? So he's easily distracted in that sense. So, but what time, how long do you think it takes before his coalition, as we talked earlier, between the tech billionaires on the one hand and the MAGA movement, the Steve Bannons and the likes on the other hand, when is the falling out? I mean,
I think the falling out is. I think the falling out is already there. But the question is, like, what's the consequence of the falling out? So, can you push MAGA out of the room? No, you can't. That's basically the entire thing. The tech bros, Musk particularly, made a brilliant move. $250 million investment, $200 billion in value added to his companies. 40% of Tesla's profits come from trading carbon credits. These guys will want to keep part of the IRA and so on and so forth. MAGA wants to burn the whole thing to the ground. It's very hard to foresee exactly who's going to win on this one, because in a sense, if you want to talk about, Besson and Treasury as essentially being the Wall Street people versus the tech people versus the MAGA people, well, ultimately, if MAGA withdraws support, Republicans in Congress get weaker. Does Trump really care about that? Or does he just care about the fact that he's the big boss and he gets to shout at everybody?
Okay, and if we now look at the European Union, obviously the von der Leyen Commission, the new von der Leyen Commission has just about started its mandate, its term, and obviously he's looking at all of this probably with an element of
concern, shall we say concern?
Concern, yes, might be despair, who knows? But, from what do you think the European Union should do in order to, obviously you cannot isolate yourself from this, but in order to prepare strategically and sort of what kind of policies to protect the interests?
Well, the first thing you should do is probably double the EU's budget, which would be very unpopular, but they've got to have some room to maneuver, to do certain things and to incentivize certain behaviors. You got to stop Italy doing side deals. You got to stop Hungary doing side deals. There has to be a united position. If the sanctions are there, you should think about what the sanctions are there for and what they're trying to achieve. If those sanctions are likely to rob you of your car industry, I can imagine putting back reciprocal sanctions on things that hurt the Americans. But the problem is they don't, apart from soy, oil, guns, planes, they don't really, do a lot. And, you're self-sufficient with Airbus because Boeing doesn't work. So, it's not, you're going to tariff Harley Davidsons. I mean, yeah, right. So it's a bit asymmetrical that way. He can hurt you more, he can hurt them. Let's think through the car example. Let's say, for example...
Well, the biggest input, obviously, is gas, liquid gas, so we're not going to slap a tariff on
also,
that.
but the thing is, Europe, given the crisis in Ukraine, is now long American LNG imports, right? So, he's got you there as well, right? So I would say it's a question of thinking through what are the strategic sectors that you really care about over the long run. What would happen if these tariffs came in? Can you survive that? Is there a way around it? If you, for example, were to move more car production in the United States, if that resulted in more demand, is that necessarily bad? Could that then be filtered back into Europe? Does Europe need to consume more on its own? It probably does. The rebalancing isn't a bad idea. So maybe this is an opportunity to say, okay, we don't want you to do the rebalancing or readjusting. This is something we've needed to do for a while. Let's use this as an opportunity to do that.
Well, I mean, in terms of, you mentioned the inner divisions within the European Union, right? So at the moment, it is very hard to see how, if you have actors such as Orban and Meloni in Italy, and who knows how any future Austrian new chancellor...
Not to mention, whatever happens in Ukraine is going to be the EU's problem much more than America's problem.
Oh, well, absolutely.
Right.
And I mean, in the last episode of the podcast, we talked about the new sort of the policy to rejuvenate the European idea is around security.
Yeah.
It's around security and defense policy.
Which is always double-edged on that one. I mean, at the end of the day, look, the Americans, if Trump wins, are about to go on a carbon bonanza, right? There's people who are like, oh, they're going to keep the IRA credits, whatever. I don't think they are. I think they're going to demolish the whole lot. If you think about the United States as an economy, it's really two economies. One's based on carbon and one's post-carbon, and they really map onto red and blue areas. So if you're MAGA-ing it out, you're going to drill, baby, drill. You're going to double down on the carbon economy, the whole thing. Forget it. They're out of Paris. They're out of everything, right? They'll probably shut down NOAA. They'll probably ban government agencies from talking about climate change. I mean, we're really at that stage. So if you do that, and Europe's only response is we need to weaponize and securitize everything, then you're just shooting yourself in the head, because the only other play you've got is China. And you're big enough and important enough that you can actually get good deals with China. It doesn't need to be this thing where you're overrun by them, right? Yes, you got strategically wrong-footed on electric cars. You should have seen that coming, but your car industries were crap. Now you're at this point where you're deliberately not putting in charging stations, which is harming your transition as well as keeping out Chinese imports. And this whole weaponization of China is just going to leave Europe on its own, because you're not going to side with the Americans on this stuff, and yet you're excluding China. So then you just become an island on your own, but you don't consume enough. So what are you going to do? How is that going to work out? I worry about this weaponization of everything.
I mean, the security policy is that you really have to build up the strategic capacity, the military capacity in the European Union, right?
So that's certainly one, absolutely.
That's the point we wanted to make. That requires a lot of additional investment. That requires probably some sort of joint debt instrument in order to achieve that. That is also something you can intuitively sell to the European population, because it intuitively makes sense that Germany with the Bundeswehr that has had a lack of investment for decades is not gonna run its own. It's also providing an opportunity to rebuild ties with the United Kingdom, because obviously the UK has
all of that's true.
Strategic.
All of that is true and good and overdue. The thing is, though, exactly, you're building it up against what? I mean, is it sort of against just basically the Russian revanchism? Fair enough, right? But so much of this is also tied into sort of security concerns about China. But at the same time, you don't want to be bullied by the Americans into being uber China hawks, which I totally understand. So I'm just pointing out that it leaves Europe in this precarious position whereby it's building up internal strength, but at the same time, its sort of external relations are becoming more fractious, because you're not going to side with MAGA America. You actually have much more in common with China, despite lots of other things you don't like about them. And it seems to me you're kind of like negotiating the worst possible place between the rock and the hard place.
So you would ease sort of the policy with China, and
it's not that I would do this. I just think that when you figure out what MAGA foreign policy really is and what American first really policy is, any illusions you have about like NATO and the transatlantic alliance and everything, they're finally over. You can put them to bed, right? What happened with Biden and Blinken and these people was just like the last tour of the Beatles, right? They came out of retirement and everybody loved the songs, but ultimately they're done.
But that leads to an interesting point, Mark. I mean, you mentioned before that a lot of people wrongly thought that 2016 was the aberration, right?
Right.
But as it stands constitutionally, this is the second and final term of President Trump. Right?
Till he suspends the Constitution.
That's why I say, as it stands at the moment, constitutionally, that's at least where we are, as we speak. But is there MAGA beyond him personally? Is this now all the main? Is this the new mainstream of U.S. politics?
I think it's the mainstream of everywhere politics. I mean, if you think about just look at trust in centre parties, trust in domestic usual institutions, etc. And it's utterly collapsed. Now, part of this has been sort of the arrogant sort of, how can I put it, the epistemic arrogance of our class, right, that didn't see the financial crisis coming, that solved it by basically doing QE, which gave even more resources to the rich. We did austerity. We know we spoke about that one a few times. Sorry about the pings going off here. I should have silenced those. We had a decade of austerity, a decade of lost growth, the whole sort of stuff. Immigration is an enormous concern of European populations, for right or wrong. The fact is, it's a fact they're concerned about this. For 15 years, there was a consensus amongst European policy elites. It was basically anyone who talks about immigration is a racist. And that just absolutely fed the backlash from the right. So, our own sort of mishandling has to be acknowledged, right, number one. But secondly, I mean, I'll give you a little story about this. I went to the Euros in the summer. And after that, I went to Scotland. I hadn't been in Scotland in a very long time. And I went to my hometown of Dundee. Now, Dundee back in the 1980s was already a pretty depressed place by many measures. We used to joke that if there was a boom in the economy, we'd have 10% unemployment, and if there was a slump, we'd have 11%. Our traditional industries were things like jute, which started to decline in the 1950s, let alone shipbuilding, etc., which was more on the Clyde side in Glasgow. But nonetheless, the city was prosperous. If you went downtown, every single store was filled. The main street, Reform Street, had solicitors' offices and expensive restaurants and all that sort of stuff, high-end sort of stuff. I went back this summer, and it was astonishing how poor the place had become. 1/3 of the stores downtown were boarded up. That Reform Street is now filled with Turkish barbers and tattoo parlors and other things, sweet shops that you do for money laundering, basically. And it's incredibly poor. And you can go to small towns all over Europe, and that's what's happened. And the people who live there are mightily pissed off, because every 4 years our class shows up and says, hey, things are going great, look at these numbers. And they're like, what does that have to do with my life? I mean, the NHS actually has a term for this. It's called shit life syndrome. Like, that's actually a diagnosis, right? So, we're worrying about these things, as if sort of like it's some kind of aberration that's been, made up by these Bengalis. Why does someone like Farage get support? He gets support because he's willing to basically acknowledge that the folks who have been in charge, or charged with the people in charge, have let most people down, and that really resonates. So I think this MAGA politics is what we're getting for the next decade. I think that we had a chance to do something about this, and we did bugger all, and now this is the consequence.
I mean, if you look at the research on populism, it's about either the ruling class doesn't want to do anything about the problems, or is not able to do anything about the problems.
Yeah, either or.
The taking back control narrative.
Yes, which is very, very powerful, absolutely. I mean, it's incredibly, think about something Farage, right? Farage brought you Brexit. Brexit was a monumentally stupid idea, and yet he not only survived, he's now running high in the polls. I mean, it tells you that people have zero faith in the mainstream. That is really alarming, but that's where we are.
So, and where would you say the mainstream needs to turn the corner? So, what needs to be done? I mean, of course, acknowledging. Well, it's a bit late maybe for acknowledging. Say, mea culpa. We've been.
Yeah, sorry, we screwed over all these areas all these times. And it's not just them. It was the processes that we unleashed. It was globalization. It was deindustrialization. It was automation. All these things kicked in at once. But the fact is, we've just lived with a giant income skew, which has been papered over in many countries by credit, which had a heart attack in 2008 and has been basically hobbling along on life support from central banks ever since. And you have a look at growth rates, have a look at investment, all of it, right around. It's all down. And part of this is also the skew, because what wealth we did generate has gone into fewer and fewer hands. So, what should we do? Well, think about, the politics of the moment. You got the British government being talked into a financial crisis by essentially the owner of X over historic sexual abuse allegations, which is very weird. But then the government doesn't help itself. I mean, rather than coming in and saying, okay, we've had 14 years of Tory mismanagement, communities have suffered, etc., we're going to rebuild and we're going to do it this way, and doing something sensible, like we need a massive house building project, we're going to focus on this. If you do house building, you get skills. With skills, you get training. With those training and skills, we can actually do green transformation stuff. Apropos Germany and the whole heat pump debacle, right? You can build it through that. You could have a coherent program. People would understand this. It would actually touch the lives of people in these communities. Instead of which, we have a 22 billion hole in the finances that needs to be papered over by taking money away from pensioners. I mean, who thought that was a good idea? They've talked the animal spirits in the British economy into the ground, and now they're looking for growth. So again, it's just sort of like chronic mismanagement, unfortunately, on the part of the mainstream. I don't see the mainstream surviving. I don't. I think we're in for a decade of MAGA. That's it.
I mean, to my mind, one of the preconditions is it's a necessary but not a sufficient condition, but it's actually public administration reform. I mean, I've just come back now out of half a decade stint in different types of government. Mm-hmm. And I've penned a longish article in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung in October. And basically, because of the structures, they're still largely based on 19th century Prussian principles in most European administrations. You're structurally unable to deliver on the things that you even want to do and promise. I give you one example. That's why I got to it, because you mentioned house building. One of the very few quantifiable targets of the outgoing German government was a house building target. So the target was to build 400,000 flats per year. And this, by no stretch of the imagination, that wasn't an outlandish target. Right. Because guess what? In the 1970s, we built 400,000 flats per year.
Yep.
Right. So, but we missed it not by a whisker, but we missed it by a country mile. Right. Out of the 400,000, 100,000 was supposed to be social housing. So the number is the social housing is less than 50,000.
Right.
And the overall target is pretty much 50% of what was, and what was supposed to be built. And that creates a problem. It's not that Olaf Scholz didn't want to do it. It's not that there was a financial problem. It's multi-level governance. There was a federal,
absolutely.
There was a federal program. Planning. It was federal money, but there's the states have to transform it into programs. But the planning permission is local government. That's yet another level. So the whole system...
and the deregulation fervor that goes along in this moment actually is not misplaced in many cases. Even sort of like good liberals in the United States who write about this sort of stuff. There's a couple of books in political science coming out about this. That basically we can't build anything anymore because we got so obsessed with procedure that making sure that everything was done exactly the right way that nothing gets done, and it costs an absolute fortune. Larry Summers made this point ages ago, and I kind of dismissed it at the time, but he was absolutely right. Years ago, when they were talking about shovel-ready projects and the stimulus and all this sort of stuff, he said, look, there's a bridge outside my window at Harvard. It's the Charles River Bridge, and it's in a terrible state. And, it's taken about 5 years to even get one side of the thing done. So I started to look into this. Well, why is it? Well, first of all, you have to ask everybody who lives within 2 square miles. Then you got to sound their opinions. Then you got to do the environmental impact assessment. Then you got to have the hearing on the environment. And you just keep going on, and eventually nothing gets done, and the bridge starts to fall down. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, add that into the sort of like, to use that great word, the shitification of everything.
I mean, the fundamental point is, and I think you can really trace it back down to Max Weber, right? So when Max Weber wrote his typology of the bureaucratic leadership, he obviously made a distinction between a charismatic leader, a bureaucratic leadership, and a monarch. Right. At the time, that was, due process was a way to legitimize the system.
That was the cutting edge of modernity. But remember, what did they have to do in those days? The most complex thing you had to do was hand out pensions. Right?
Well, exactly.
And if you wanted to build something, you just went off and built it. But now, not going to happen.
Well, absolutely. I mean, now the whole that was basically my punchline in this article is the whole system's process driven and not outcome driven at all.
I totally agree.
And you need to be outcome driven, and that leads to counterintuitive conclusion. In some areas, for some specific purposes, there is a progressive case for deregulation.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm 100% on that. I mean, I'll give you a micro example from where I live. I've got a mate who lives too close to the water, right? Put it that way.
Right.
And every now and again, flood, right? So what you can do is, and they've all got these big boulders that are largely decorative. And one of the neighbours basically cemented the boulders together because then it creates a seawall. And the local government came along and fined him $15,000 and told him to take it down. And he said, well, why would I do that? And he says, because you don't have permission to do that. We don't allow you to do that. He goes, but I'm a structural engineer. This is creating a seawall. We all have these boulders. If we do this, we won't flood, and then everyone will save money. And they're like, nah, sorry, mate. Computer says, no, you can't do that. Right?
Exactly. It's computer says no.
Computer says no, right?
The rule book says no, and that's why it cannot be done.
Exactly.
And that's the problem, and that's why even on progressive policies, and if you look at the policy areas, I mean, you touched upon it, that seem to be higher at the top of the pyramid. It's the bread and butter stuff. It's cost of living, it's housing.
Totally.
It's that kind of stuff where you actually need to deliver.
Yeah.
And if you look at the regulation, I mean, you can actually make the argument if you operate a system that is process driven, the outcome is very often process because
absolutely.
regulation.
That's, by the way, there's a great example of that was Adam Tooze a couple of years ago. He wrote this brilliant Substack piece about how the global climate change effort is actually just basically an industry of people who go from conference to conference making proposals and then writing procedures, and then nothing happens. And then they go to the next conference and do the same thing over and over again. And it's like, this is in a sense what the graduates of these our universities do, right? They become consultants of sorts. And then everything is about like, well, we got a plan and a process, right? Did you implement it? Did you invest it? No, we just went to the next place and did the same thing. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at what is regulation? Regulation, to a large extent, is a definition of process for other people.
Yeah.
Right? So And that's why it's maybe not surprising that a system that is driven by process itself is producing lots of regulation.
Absolutely.
But everything that is deliverable, really deliverable, like housing, digitization, all of these projects where you really have to implement the project and actually create deliverables.
Yeah.
All of this has become so difficult. And that's why at least part of the reason in my mind, that's why I'm getting involved here in the efforts to try to reform public administration to make it outcome driven rather than process driven. That's a precondition, because otherwise what will happen is the next government will come in.
Yeah, and the same thing will happen again. Absolutely.
And the same thing will happen again.
Yeah. A great example of this was High Speed 2 in the United Kingdom, where they spent hundreds and hundreds of millions, if not billions of pounds, basically connecting Birmingham to London. And why was this? Well, because everyone got involved in the planning regulations. And I believe 60% of the track ended up being buried because nobody wanted to look at a train. It's like, no, you can't do that. Right? If the only thing that matters is not in my backyard, nothing ever gets done. And that's what we've allowed to grow up. So I agree that's a huge part of it. But again, just simple sort of like dissatisfaction with, the way things are, people's future prospects, etc. How much? Let me think about, for example, I keep going back to Britain because I know the place really well, right? But, think about what they did to universities. So you had some of the best universities in the world. You decided you'd do an off-balance sheet move and basically give them fees. You gave them fees that kind of paid the way. Then you allowed them to go to 9,000 quid. 9,000 quid was only going to work if you allow 9,000 quid to go up because your costs go up. They then become huge landowners, basically building lots and lots of accommodation for students. Usually there's banking on China coming in. So they're basically long real estate at this point in time. Their balance sheets are completely contingent upon these fees coming in all the time. But then there's a cap on the fees, and they just start to run out of cash. And now the entire sector's in crisis. Either you take it back in the public balance sheet, which they simply can't afford to do after a decade of having it off balance sheet, or you basically start charging American levels of fees. And if you do that, then higher education becomes a luxury good. So, when you've taken and the really ironic thing is that it depends how you count it. But higher education is actually the fourth or fifth biggest export that the the United Kingdom has, by bringing people in and banking it as a services export. So, you basically turn domestic higher education into an export earner with a cap on price. I mean, it's just like, why would you do that?
And you cut yourself off from the biggest market as well through Brexit.
Yeah, and you cut yourself off the biggest market through Brexit. Absolutely. So, self-harm on self-harm.
Dear. So, Mark,
it's not a happy time. I mean, it's not a happy time, but at the same time, let's try and put sort of if not something positive in it. There's only so much technocratic nudging that we can do before the system blows up. And, I think we've reached its limits. I did an interview with a radio program over here a little while ago, and I'll repeat what I said there, because it's actually Henry Farrell who came up with this. It's on his Substack programmable Mutter, which is really worth a look. But essentially, the Democratic Party is filled with people who don't actually think things need to change that much. We need to have some rights for people that are on the margins, whether they happen to be, gay or transsexual or whatever. We need to be thorough on civil rights and make sure the minority communities are protected. Economic redistribution? No, we don't really do that one. Maybe a little bit more higher taxes. But fundamentally, things are okay. Let's put in a few airbags, right? And also trust us. We know what's going on. We're the best people to manage things. And I just don't think that anybody believes that anymore. And there are huge parts of Western communities that essentially want things to change. Now, do they want them to change in a progressive way? No. I mean, the whole immigration story is just a tragedy of mismanagement. We should have had a proper conversation about immigration. We should have actually, really said, look, do communities have the right to decide who lives amongst them or not, right? Because, we're a democracy. Do we allow this or not? If we don't allow this, what are we actually saying? At the same time, you've got aging populations. They're becoming less healthy as they get older. Healthcare systems throughout Europe and also in the United States are basically held up by skilled immigrant labor. Do you really want to ban all that, right? So this is a huge mess of a policy area. And we really, really screwed up by basically saying, nobody talk about it for the next 15 years. That was just really, really dumb. And it's handed the whole thing to the right because they'll talk about it as long as you want.
Well, I mean, as it looks, in the German election, the center will hold at least once more. So, but that is really, I wouldn't quite say the last shot, but it's going to be a critical government coming in now in the spring, not just for Germany, but also obviously for Europe, right?
Yep.
With a lot of other countries in political difficulties. So this is going to be a pivotal time now in the second half of the 2020s, whether we can turn the corner or not. I mean, we've mentioned an awful lot of difficult issues, but as we close, Mark, give me one reason to be cheerful.
Reasons to be cheerful. It's really hard at the moment. I mean, I'm living in a country whereby they might suspend the constitution next week. All right, so what continues apace, right? I think the long-term play on this is, and this is sort of the next book that I'm writing, which is essentially America's about to make a really big mistake. And the big mistake is to double down on carbon. Because at the end of the day, climate change is a problem of physics. It's not a problem of politics. And it doesn't care what you think, and it doesn't care if you deny it. And even though there are sort of anti-green populist moves in the EU, you don't really have the type of intense carbon coalitions and lobbyists for carbon in the EU that you have in the United States. It's more fragmented. You've got examples like Norway, whereby they live off carbon, but then they build a green economy, right? Denmark and other places show that this can be done. Austria didn't give a crap about green stuff. Now, because its firms are key parts of the supply chains of firms that want to get into this space, they start doing it. So there's lots of momentum apart from policy and still in policy in Europe to push us in a kind of green transition direction. China's 100% serious about this. Yes, they open coal mines, but they open coal mines to make the electricity, to make the polysilicon, to put up the solar. And now that America's decided it doesn't want to do that, it's basically going to dominate and supply, essentially, in a very progressive way, the rest of the world with the green tech it needs to adapt. And that's going to go ahead either. And I think that sadly 10 years from now, when America comes off its carbon binge, a bit like sort of the frat boy that discovers the keg of beer at 2 a.m, that when you get to 6 and you've drunk the lot, nobody really cares anymore and the party's over. At that point in time, I think America has to make some hard choices. But for the next decade, in a world that's carbon short, in a world that even with a huge on-supply of carbon coming from Argentina, Guyana, Brazil, Indonesia, America is not the swing producer in the way that Saudi is, but it can live with really low prices. It can help lower costs. It can do a lot of things there. They're going to go down this way. And in the short term, it's going to make a lot of cash and, it's going to work. But I think in the long term, what it does is it just really questions the future role of American leadership, because the rest of the world, the other 7.7 billion people, are just going to go, no, we're going to go that way, mate. It's a different direction. And I think that long-term travel, that's just the long-term direction of travel. And America's about to put itself in the wrong foot. So it's not a hopeful one in the sense that I think what it does is it causes a lot of disruption. If we end up with high tariffs, if 5 years after that we end up with rebalancing, if we end up with the Germans much less addicted to doing exports and able to consume, given that they've got the quote-unquote fiscal space, hate that term, don't think it's real, but nonetheless, right, you can actually then build, you can do the infrastructure, you can do the things you need to do, you can consume more, you can rebalance. A rebalanced world economy over the next decade would be much better than the permanently imbalanced one that we've got now that is addicted to the supply of treasury bills to keep it going. So I think that if you take those bigger macro trends that are going to dominate the next 10 years, yeah, it's going to be rough for a while. But at the end of the day, if we want to survive as a species, and most of us do, that's the direction of travel. It's just a tragedy that America's about to go in another direction.
Well, Mark, on that note, thank you very much again for joining me today to discuss these matters. I mean, obviously, this one calls for an extension at some point down the lane.
Yeah, I mean, we should check. Basically, we should check in 3 months and see exactly what has happened, what they want to do, how wrong I was about everything that I said here, and then do a course correction.
And see whether the Constitution is still in place.
Exactly. I mean, who knows? Who knows? You might have to try and find me in one of the internment camps.
Well, that's certainly not going to happen. I'm pretty confident about that. So, Mark, let's catch up soon again and see how the thing goes. Thank you very much.
All the best.
This is Social Europe Podcast. We are dedicated to strengthening democracy by discussing the most pressing political, economic, and social issues of our time. So welcome and enjoy the conversation.